Today, we're going to talk about self permission, and we're going to explore how modern life, through relentless structuring and scheduling and efficiency, can very subtly but very profoundly erode personal agency. Specifically, I want to look at how constant external validation and reliance on productivity systems conditions a loss of intrinsic self permission, which is a core function of personal agency. And we'll draw on some philosophical insights from Isaiah Berlin and psychological frameworks from Carol Gilligan to understand this phenomenon a little bit more deeply. So let's look at this concept of the illusion of agency in structured lives. So, modern productivity culture emphasizes structured efficiency, right? Time blocking apps, calendar notifications, project management software. And each one of these tools promises liberation through organization. And yet, this meticulous external scaffolding can paradoxically produce a sense of helplessness because individuals learn to rely on external prompts like alarms and notifications and calendar invites to justify action. And they begin to wait for permission before initiating tasks or engaging in behaviors. And this externally driven permission architecture creates an illusion of agency. Tasks get done, metrics improve, superficial autonomy thrives. But beneath the surface, a quiet erosion occurs, the gradual outsourcing of self permission. Over time, the ability to act spontaneously and intrinsically is replaced by passive obedience to pre structured systems. So, I want to draw from a pretty popular concept, this philosophical framework of positive versus negative freedom. So, Isaiah Berlin, in his seminal essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, 1958, distinguishes between negative freedom, which is a freedom from external constraints, and positive freedom, which is freedom to realize one's potential. Um, so, negative freedom is freedom from external constraints, positive freedom is freedom to realize one's potential. And modern productivity culture provides abundant negative freedom. It removes immediate barriers through scheduling and systematization, but it rarely fosters positive freedom, which is the deeper capacity to choose actions independently of external validation. So when someone only experiences negative freedom, their world feels permissive superficially. They are free from chaos and disorder, but they might still lack the positive freedom, the sense of psychological autonomy to initiate meaningful action independently. And true agency demands positive freedom, the capacity and the muscle memory for self directed permission that remains robust, even without external structure or validation. So, what's the psychological cost of letting this muscle of positive freedom to atrophy? Well, the cost is your voice and the cost is your autonomy. So, Carol Gilligan's work in developmental psychology, especially her influential book, In a Different Voice, 1982, really good book, highlights the importance of voice and autonomy. And Gilligan argues that psychological maturity and moral agency depend fundamentally on developing an authentic internal voice, an ability to act from intrinsic understanding rather than merely responding to an external set of expectations or rules. And this over reliance on structured productivity systems, it systematically weakens the internal voice. And when actions are continually validated externally by notifications and schedules and productivity apps or peer pressure or any other form of external stimuli, and that becomes the mode by which we motivate and prompt and initiate action in our own lives, then individuals lose confidence in their internal decision-making capabilities. And then they look back over the past 5 years and they say, why haven't I been doing the things that I want to be doing? And it's because it's not because you can't imagine doing something different. It's because you haven't been practicing initiating action from your own mind. It's because you've made yourself a leech on the external structures handed to you. And these individuals increasingly require external signals more and more before feeling justified to act until they're fully emotionally dependent on these structures and on these rhythms so that they cannot generate something from within, which basically dilutes their psychological autonomy and intrinsic motivation. And this loss of an internal voice manifests as chronic hesitation. It manifests as anxiety about acting without explicit approval and an underlying sense of insecurity, no matter how externally productive they might appear. So we have to relearn self-permission, and recovering this internal self-permission, it requires consciously shifting away from external validation towards intrinsic motivation. This involves retraining oneself to recognize and trust internal cues of value and internal cues of urgency and significance and meaningfulness. What do I value? I do have I have an entire video series on developing a personal value system I'm going to do. But retraining oneself to recognize and trust internal cues of value, this is less about eliminating the structure that you have. And if you've seen most of my other videos, you know that I'm not anti-structure. It's more about practicing selective detachment and emotional and logistical and rhythmic dependency upon the external. So how do we do this? Well, here's a few ideas. Number one, permission breaks. You deliberately schedule blocks of unstructured time without predefined goals to reacquaint oneself with spontaneous decision making. This is actually really hard, especially if you're already caught up in the rhythm of external validation. It's very difficult, and internally you probably think to yourself, well, that sounds like an absolute waste of time and not worth my time. Right. That's what you would think, right? You don't understand the value of resetting. You don't understand it's like saying that about going to the gym, right? It's like saying I should never go to the gym because at no point is going to the gym ever genuinely productive. Like, right, but going to the gym consistently over the long term is productive, right? So so giving yourself a permission break and scheduling unstructured blocks of time is a short-term strategy that pays long-term dividends. So you have to engage in long-term thinking. The second method that you can use to kind of reacquaint yourself with that sense of intrinsic or personal agency is an intrinsic audit. So regularly evaluate which tasks are intrinsically valuable to you versus more externally justified, and shifting more decisively towards internally meaningful activities. I did this recently because it had been kind of like years since I feel like I had done anything that really lit me up and gave me that spark, because I've been focusing so much on stability and routine and being pragmatic and focusing on logistical, adult-oriented outcomes, that that I had not indulged some of the more internal motivation structures that had previously been really enjoyable for me and had been very powerful sources of decisive action for me. So that's like one of the reasons I started doing this YouTube thing, because because I used to live in the realm of ideas. It used to be my career, and it's really not anymore. And so now this gives me the space and the opportunity to continue to think and express, teach in ways that I find personally valuable, and and to give myself an outlet of alignment in that way. I did an intrinsic audit and realized I hadn't given myself anything like this in years, and that this is not the life that I wanted to live. Um, so do an intrinsic audit. Say which tasks are intrinsically valuable versus merely externally justified. Give yourself those scheduled permission breaks, and then finally focus. And this is something you may want to uh, maybe go to a trusted friend and work through this with them. Is voice development. So actively practice making decisions based purely on internal rationale. Even trivial contexts to strengthen psychological autonomy, maybe practice this with a friend. Practice this in low stakes contexts, right? And say, and just talk through it with them. Sometimes it's helpful to talk through doing these kinds of things with somebody else and just have them validate that for you. And you got to be really selective about who you do this with, because you might run into somebody that tries to reinforce the external. It doesn't really get the exercise, but you want to develop that inner voice. And we have a video on the inner voice, but you want to develop that sense of the internal voice inside of you, so that you know how to listen for what your values are, and you know how to translate your value into action, and you've got that muscle memory saying, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I want, this is the action I'm going to take, this is how I want my day to look, this is how my day is going to look, right? Developing that muscle and that confidence and that decisiveness, um, that is something that probably feels hard if you haven't done it much, but it becomes easy when it becomes practiced. It be you know um, Having a decisive relationship with your own time and energy is something that becomes easy when it becomes practice. So just practice, and again, begin in small stakes, low low willpower tax, low energy environments, and slowly scale up from there. You'll be surprised how quickly you'll feel that muscle memory of decisiveness come to you. So these strategies really aren't about reverting to chaos. They're about consciously redeveloping the psychological muscle of self permission. So, allowing action to flow from internal coherence rather than external prompts. So, so how do we navigate this tension? Reclaiming internal self permission is a structure in a structured world, involves navigating this nuanced tension that exists. External structures are not inherently harmful. They provide the necessary scaffolding for functioning in complex environments, and for interfacing and coordinating with others. And yet, when these structures overshadow internal autonomy, they create a fragile, externally dependent agency inside of you. And the goal is not to abandon these structured systems, but to balance them with deliberate practices of self permission. So, developing a robust internal voice is essential for true psychological autonomy and positive freedom. Remember, negative freedom is freedom from, positive freedom is freedom to. And ultimately, self permission isn't merely about productivity, it's about reclaiming a deeper, authentic agency, an agency that's capable of initiating action from your own set of values without external validation. There's nothing wrong with receiving a notification or a scheduling cue. But if that is but if those notifications are what set the cadence of your psychological life, and are the drum to which your sense of agency like sets its own cadence, right? Then what's happening is you're eroding your sense of power. You're eroding your positive freedom the more you let the cadence of external notifications and external structures set the tone, set the rhythm for your life. It's about it's about acting, not just because you can, but because you choose to. And this is the concept of self permission. This is how you give yourself permission is that you recognize when I show up to my day and it's a schedule full of things and I just plow through. There's two ways to relate to a schedule full of things or a big task list that has external stakeholders that needs to be done and I need to do them because they give me money and I need to pay my rent and you're bound up in this like social economic web and you feel caught there like a fly, like you have no agency at all. But you do have agency. The agency is in your mind. The agency, again, comes from saying, okay, I'm going to engage with this task list as an exercise in positive agency because I'm going to be disciplined enough to practice selective detachment in the ways that I talked about earlier, where you give yourself those scheduled permission breaks, where you do that intrinsic audit and you say, is this really what I value? What can I do that I do value? And then you do that voice development where you create that signal where there's a real signal, there's a real communication, there's a live active radio frequency happening between your inner voice and your actions so that you have a sense of positive agency and decisiveness and you have and then you develop that sense of self-trust that when I want something, I'll find a way to enact it in my life. So rather than quietly, passively building up this sense of resentment and fear and sadness about how your life isn't what you want, you trust because you have a growing track record with yourself. I know my voice. I'm auditing myself. I'm giving myself unstructured time to cultivate myself. I know that I'm not a slave to external cues. I know that I have the muscle memory to exercise self permission, and therefore I trust that if I'm going to defer gratification, if I'm going to delay getting what I want so that I focus on other people's priorities, that's okay because that's part of the cadence of my life. Those tasks are marching to the beat of the drum I set. They're playing to the tune I determine. It's a lot about mindset, but it's also a lot about having some of those practices that keep that level of conscious connection between your internal voice and your external actions alive. That is what self permission is. And what it can do for you is save you and spare you from a life of helplessness in which you feel that your life is slipping away from you and you're never going to live the life you want. Instead, it gives you a conscious connection between what you want and how you act. And when you defer gratification rather than building up resentment, you have an understanding and a self trust that this is part of a broader life of self agency that you have architected and you have designed and you have determined. And any trade offs that you make are not part of a system that is slowly taxing more and more and more of your soul. It's part of a game you're playing for your good, for your benefit. That's what the concept or the muscle memory or the skill of self permission can do for you.